I just asked for a bottle of water." She refused. Not because of the rules, but because I am not like the people she's used to serving. On a regular commercial flight, a middle-aged woman sat quietly in the first-class cabin. She didn't demand. She didn't create pressure. She simply pressed the call button to request a bottle of water. Her throat dry from a rushed morning, but instead of receiving courtesy, she was met with distant condescension and a loud refusal in front of dozens of other passengers. No one spoke up. No one reacted. Everyone buried their faces in their books, in their screens, pretending not to see. What they didn't know was that this woman was far from ordinary. She was Margaret Callen, a federal judge, someone who had dedicated her life to crafting laws that protect fairness and human dignity. And from the moment she was denied a simple request, she forced an entire industry to confront how they treated people. Not through anger, but through a silence heavier than any accusation. This is not just a story about discrimination. It's a story about awakening, about the power of calm, and how one woman changed an entire system simply by refusing to be made invisible. If you're looking for a story that is emotional, thought-provoking, and deeply moving, then you're in the right place. Like, share this video, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next inspiring and emotional stories. Now let's begin the journey of flight BA 305, where a bottle of water became the turning point for an entire industry. She sat in the first-class cabin, calm, polite, and discreet. When she gently requested a bottle of water, the flight attendant stopped, then loudly refused in front of all the passengers. No one spoke up, no one questioned it, but what no one in the cabin knew was that the woman was far from ordinary. For, with just a quiet text message, everything was about to change. The flight, the crew, and the airline would never be the same again. She settled into the plush seat in the front row of the first class, her hand resting lightly on the leather armrest, exuding the quiet confidence she naturally carried. Her name was Judge Margaret Callen, but not many would recognize her face among the other passengers, dressed in a finely tailored charcoal gray suit with salt and pepper hair neatly tied at the back, and a posture of quiet pride that required no proof she conveyed everything about herself without needing an introduction. In her hand was a slim black folder containing handwritten notes, the final revisions for an important speech she would present the following morning. A speech about integrity, fairness, and the power of quiet restraint. As the last passenger boarded, Margaret pressed the call button. Her throat was dry, a consequence of rushing through the morning and not having time to buy water at the airport. Her eyes remained fixed on the seat pocket in front of her as she waited in silence. A few minutes later, the flight attendant approached. The name tag read Carlin. She was in her early 40s with neatly curled blonde hair, a stiff smile that never reached her eyes. Carlin didn't greet her. She didn't ask what she needed. She just stood there, looking down, seemingly waiting for Margaret to figure out what to say. Margaret spoke softly. "Could I have a bottle of water?" "Please?" Carlin crossed her arms over her chest. "We haven't started serving water yet." "I understand," Margaret replied calmly. "It's just that my throat is a little dry. If it's not too much trouble, ma'am." Carlin interrupted, her voice louder. Heads in the first-class cabin began to turn. "I told you we haven't started serving. You'll have to wait until we finish boarding and the plane reaches cruising altitude." There was no reason to speak so loudly, Margaret knew that, and the man in the gray suit sitting next to her knew it too. He bent down to his book, suddenly becoming very engrossed. "I'm not trying to cause any trouble," she answered quietly. Callen didn't respond. She stood there a moment longer, then turned and walked off without a word. Margaret didn't turn her head to look around, but she felt the change in the air, the glances, the judgment, the silent questions in the eyes of others. What hurt wasn't the denial of water. It was the feeling of being evaluated. No one spoke up. No one offered a hand. She wasn't surprised, but that didn't make it any easier. Margaret opened her handbag, took out her phone, and typed a message. Refused water service in first class. No reason. It's deliberate. Inform Nicholas. She hit send, put her phone back, and returned to her notes. Her face didn't change, but her heartbeat was no longer steady. Nicholas Heron, the airline's CEO, was more than a professional connection. He was a longtime friend, someone who respected her beyond her title. Margaret didn't complain. She didn't make a scene. But she had made a call, silent and unseen, and that call was about to change everything. The plane continued boarding. Margaret remained seated, her hand resting on the folder. Her outward calm concealed the thoughts that replayed the recent exchange in her mind. Callen's tone, the way she looked at Margaret as though she didn't belong in that seat. It wasn't about the water. It was about the way Callen had denied her very humanity. A simple request turned into an inconvenience. Margaret had faced moments like that before, subtle, sharp, and always in silence. But this time her intuition told her this wouldn't be ignored. Callen walked down the aisle with casual ease, smiling at a man in a blue suit, nodding friendly at a woman in a silk scarf, even helping a teenage boy stow his luggage. Not once did she glance back at Margaret. In the galley, Callen leaned against the counter and exhaled sharply. A younger flight attendant, Haley, was arranging the water trays. "Everything okay?" Haley asked without looking up. Callen shrugged. "Some people think the world owes them something." The woman in 2A demanded water as if she were a queen. Haley stopped what she was doing. Did she ask politely? Callen scoffed. It wasn't how she asked, it was the attitude, you could tell. She's the type who thinks she should always get special treatment. Haley didn't respond immediately. She knew Callen well, strict especially with certain types of passengers. "I get it," Haley said quietly. "But being kind doesn't hurt." Callen raised an eyebrow, offering no reply. She returned to organizing the trays, moving decisively quickly. Meanwhile, in first class, Margaret's phone buzzed in her bag. She picked it up. It was a message from Nicholas Heron. "What happened? Send me the flight number." Her fingers tapped quickly. "Flight BA 305 to Hallberg. Denied basic courtesy." Not the first time, but this time it was public and loud. I stayed calm. A moment later, her phone buzzed again. "Thank you, stay put. I'll handle it." Margaret turned off the screen and laid the phone face down on the table. She knew what that meant. Nicholas wasn't the type of person to call just to complain. He was the type who would show up to make things right. And when he acted, the silence would no longer weigh on her, but on them. Margaret returned to her documents, pretending to read, but her mind had already left the lines of text, the seatbelt sign illuminated. The captain's voice came over the loudspeaker. The usual announcements repeated, the wheels lifted off the ground, but inside the cabin, everything was still churning. 20 minutes after takeoff, Callen began serving drinks in first class. She moved with mechanical politeness, the smile back on her face, but her eyes remained devoid of warmth. Margaret watched her approach. each passenger calling their names politely, greeting them cheerfully, pouring wine and sparkling water, even joking lightly. When Caroline reached Margaret's row, the cart hesitated slightly and her smile faded. She avoided eye contact and asked, "Would you like something to drink?" Margaret looked at her calmly. Still, no water. The cart was filled with bottled water in front of her. Caroline cleared her throat. "Of course, I should have brought it earlier." She poured the water into a glass, gently placed it on the table, and moved on to the next passenger without waiting for a response. But it was too late. And Caroline knew it. She just didn't know how far it had gone. In the galley, Haley was wiping down the counter when the internal phone rang. Caroline quickly picked up, assuming it was the captain with an update. But when she listened, her face changed. She didn't speak for a few seconds, just nodded slightly, her eyes narrowing, her lips tightening. When she set the receiver down, she stood still as if processing what had just happened. Haley glanced over. "Everything okay?" Caroline didn't answer right away. Her fingers clenched the edge of the counter. "It's the captain. He wants to see me immediately." Haley blinked. Why, Caroline didn't respond. She adjusted her uniform and walked off without a word, her steps much quicker than before. In the cockpit, the captain was waiting. His face showed no emotion. A video call was already set up on the safety screen next to the control panel. On the screen was a man in a dark suit seated in an office with the airline's logo behind him. It was Nicholas Heron Carlin. The captain called his tone flat. "Explain what happened with the passenger in seat 2A. She hesitated. "She asked for water before we began serving. I told her she had to wait. That's the standard procedure." Nicholas's voice came through the speakers sharp and clear. "And is it part of your standard procedure to raise your voice at passengers when they ask for a basic courtesy?" Caroline was speechless. She hadn't expected him to be so direct. "I didn't mean it that way," she stammered. Nicholas didn't blink. "The passenger you disrespected is Judge Margaret Callen, a keynote speaker, a federal judge, and above all, a person deserving of respect." Caroline opened her mouth but closed it again. "We're not going to argue about what happened," Nicholas continued. "We'll correct the mistake. You'll apologize clearly, publicly, with no excuses." The captain stood beside him, silent. When the plane lands, Nicholas added, "You will come directly to my office." The screen went dark. Caroline stood there motionless. For the first time in years, she had lost control of the situation. In seat 2A, Margaret took a sip of water. Her gaze was steady. Her silence was intentional. She didn't need to raise her voice. Caroline returned to the cabin, but her walk no longer exuded the same confidence. Many passengers noticed the change, her stiff posture, clenched jaw, and averted gaze. She stopped in front of first class, adjusted her uniform with trembling fingers, and then walked toward Margaret's seat. Margaret didn't look up immediately. She turned a page in her documents, circled a sentence with her pen, then slowly raised her eyes. Their gazes met. There was no anger in Margaret's eyes, nor any sense of smugness. Just a calmness that made Caroline more nervous than any shouting could have. Judge Callen. Caroline started her voice much smaller than it had been when boarding. "I want to apologize for earlier. I misjudged the situation and handled it poorly. I'm sorry if I upset you." The apology sounded rehearsed hollow, as though someone had forced her to say it. Margaret's voice was deep but firm. "You didn't misjudge the situation. You misjudged me." Callen flinched but stood still. "I only asked for water." Margaret continued. "And you made a judgment about me based on what you thought I shouldn't be." A man across the aisle slowly set down his tablet. Several others began to turn their heads. "I've flown with this airline for 15 years," Margaret said, her voice still calm. "First-class business economy. And I've seen how you treat customers when there's no one supervising." Callen's throat tightened. She opened her mouth to say something, but Margaret raised her hand in a gesture to stop. "I don't care for empty apologies," she said. "If you're truly sorry, understand this. What you did was not a misunderstanding. It was a choice." Those words hung in the air. No one said anything. The entire cabin fell into a heavy silence. Margaret picked up her glass of water and took a slow sip. "You may go now." Callen hesitated, then turned and walked away without another word, her face red with shame. Back in the galley, she leaned against the counter, breathing heavily. Her eyes stared blankly ahead, her ears still ringing with Margaret's words. It was a choice. That phrase kept echoing. She had received complaints before. Some passengers were rude, some unreasonable, but no one had ever made her feel so exposed. No one had ever had the power to change the entire atmosphere of the cabin with just a few soft words. Haley stood nearby saying nothing. She had heard most of it, and she could feel it too. Something in the air had changed. Even those pretending not to notice could sense it. Haley didn't need to say anything. Her gaze was enough to show no more excuses. In seat 2A, Margaret had returned to her documents, but this time she wasn't reading any more. Margaret's mind had drifted far from the words on the page. The apology, though superficial, had been made publicly, and that, however small, still carried meaning. The passengers who had previously ignored her were now looking at her with different eyes. Curious, hesitant. Perhaps even a bit guilty. A young man in a light gray suit sitting across the aisle leaned slightly toward her. His voice was quiet, careful. "Sorry, I saw what happened earlier. I just wanted to say that was really wrong. You handled that situation far more calmly than most people would." Margaret gave a slight nod. "Thank you." He hesitated before asking, "Does this kind of thing happen often?" Margaret looked directly at him. "More than you think." He fell silent, sitting up straight, unsure how to respond. Margaret turned her face toward the window. Outside, the clouds drifted lazily, but inside the cabin, the atmosphere had changed. The silence now had weight. It was no longer indifference, but awareness. And once awareness begins, it is not easily dismissed. She didn't need acknowledgement from strangers. But clearly, something had cracked. The indifferent shell that had surrounded the cabin since she was denied the water bottle, it was gone. Instead, there was another feeling. Not her shame, but theirs. The phone in the armrest vibrated lightly, a message from Nicholas mid-flight update. The council has been notified. A policy review will begin this week. Stay calm. She will never serve another passenger without thinking carefully again. Margaret locked the screen and intertwined her fingers. The consequences weren't over. They had only just begun. The flight continued as if nothing had happened, but the tension hadn't dissipated. It hung in the air beneath the quiet conversations and the clinking of glass. Passengers still pretended to focus on their books or screens, but their eyes occasionally flicked toward seat 2A, the seat where Margaret sat, calm, unreadable. In the galley, Callen lingered longer than usual, She busied herself with the items that had been arranged earlier, her hands moving but her mind elsewhere. In her 12 years as a flight attendant, she'd encountered angry drunk, rude, even offensive passengers, but no one had ever made her feel as small as she did now. Margaret hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't made a scene. But it was that very calmness, that dignity that left her with no excuses. No shouts, no curses, just a look, silence, and a mirror reflecting her own behavior. Haley spoke up, breaking the silence. "You didn't think before acting." Callen spun around. "What I mean?" Haley hesitated before continuing. "You've always been strict, but this time it's different." "You didn't know who she was." Callen crossed her arms, her tone hard. "I don't care about status, but you care about appearances," Haley said softly but firmly. "You looked at her and made a judgment before she even spoke." Callen clenched her jaw. "I followed procedure." Haley stared directly at her. "No. You acted on instinct, and that instinct was wrong." Callen didn't argue any more. She turned away, pretending to check the oven's temperature. Up front, in the cockpit, the captain received a message via the internal channel. It was short and to the point. "Mr. Nicholas Heron will be waiting at the gate for flight. BA 305, prepare for priority. Disembarkation for passenger 2A security team will be present." He looked at the passenger list, row 2A, Judge Margaret Callen. The captain exhaled slowly. This was no longer an internal matter. Things were escalating quickly. In her seat, Margaret continued reading her materials, unaware of the plans unfolding silently behind the scenes. But she observed, she watched how people reacted, how the silence gradually turned into furtive glances, how the feeling of guilt no longer rested on her shoulders but began to spread around her. A man in the row behind her whispered to his wife. An elderly woman with lavish jewelry kept glancing ahead, then looking down, her face rigid. These were the ones who hadn't said a word, the ones who had chosen comfort over conscience. And now they were the ones who felt out of place. Margaret didn't need to make them feel that way. She just needed to be present, and that she knew was what made them more uncomfortable than anything else. The seatbelt sign lit up again. The captain's voice came through the speakers. "Dear passengers, we are beginning our descent. Please ensure your seatbelt is fastened and your tray table is stowed. The crew is preparing for landing." Margaret closed the file, tucked it into her bag, and adjusted her glasses. Outside the window, the city appeared faintly. Inside the plane, a confrontation was silently taking shape. The air in the cabin was thick. The usual hustle and bustle of landing people stretching, chatting, preparing to gather their things had vanished. Passengers sat upright but tense. Many glanced toward Margaret as if she didn't notice. A few didn't even try to hide it. A man tapped his fingers nervously on the armrest. A couple whispered to each other, their eyes flicking toward seat 2A and then toward the galley. Margaret remained still. Her hand rested lightly on her lap. Her face remained calm, emotionless. But the weight of everything hung in the air, hovering over every glance, every unspoken thought. Callen hadn't returned to first class since the apology. She retreated to the galley. Her hands kept moving, but her mind was a tangled mess. She'd never wished for a flight to end so quickly, and for the first time in her life, she truly feared landing, because she knew waiting for her on the ground. It wasn't an assistant. It wasn't a supervisor. It was Mr. Nicholas Heron, and that spoke volumes. This time, it was no longer an internal matter. no longer something kept behind closed doors in a meeting room. Haley leaned against the galley counter, her arms crossed. "Are you okay?" Callen didn't respond. "Do you know what you're going to say?" Still. Silence. Haley exhaled quietly. You just needed to give her a bottle of water. Callen was about to react, but stopped herself. Because that was the issue. She had thought she was just following procedure. But now she knew it was a choice, and that choice could no longer be defended up front. The captain was entering the final code to request permission to land. He glanced briefly at the screen, then at the list of senior executives who would be present when the plane arrived. After nearly 2 decades of flying for this airline, he had never seen the CEO personally greet a flight. And now he understood why Margaret's phone buzzed lightly in the seat pocket. She took it out and read the message from Nicholas Herron. "We are at gate 16. I'll be there when the door opens. You'll be the first to disembark. There will be press outside. Just a heads up." Margaret pursed her lips. She didn't need the attention. She didn't need the media. But if those cameras made someone like Callen think twice in the future, then let them take the shots. The plane landed smoothly, the wheels hitting the tarmac with a familiar rumble. No one clapped. No one congratulated. Only the sound of the landing system and the faint screech of the brakes. The captain's voice came over the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Halberg. The current time is 4:26 p.m. Please keep your seatbelt fastened until the seatbelt sign is turned off. Thank you for flying with us." Margaret bent down to unfasten her seatbelt, adjusting her blazer. The woman, who had been dismissed as a mere inconvenience that morning, was now the silent focal point of the entire cabin. The seatbelt sign went off. Immediately, 2 well-dressed staff members entered from the galley, standing to one side to clear the way. Haley emerged from the galley, leaning in to whisper quickly, "They're requesting that seat. 2A disembarks first." Callen stood off to the side, her arms stiff at her sides. She didn't look. She didn't speak. Margaret stood up, slinging her handbag over her shoulder, walking slowly and steadily toward the aircraft door with grace and composure. She didn't glance at the other passengers. She didn't need to look, for their silence and their guilty eyes spoke for everything. As she reached the door, the scene outside was completely different. A black sedan was parked waiting. Airport security stood at attention, flanking the narrow path. And at the center, Nicholas Herron, tall, sharp in his gray suit, his gaze focused on only one person. He stepped forward, giving a small nod, "Welcome back." And with that, she stepped off the plane, the door closed behind her, leaving the cabin silent as death, for everyone knew this flight would never be forgotten. Once Margaret had left the aircraft, the atmosphere shifted completely. The jet bridge, usually busy with carts and crew, was eerily quiet. Airport security stood at attention on either side of the narrow passage, their stances rigid but not lax. And ahead, Nicholas Herron, the CEO of the airline, in his charcoal suit hands, clasped before him, his gaze calm yet profound. Margaret didn't hesitate. She walked forward with the same calmness that had made the entire first class tremble hours earlier. Nicholas extended his hand. "Thank you for your patience." Margaret shook his hand, giving a slight nod. "And thank you for respecting this." He didn't ask what had happened. He didn't need to. Every word, every reaction, every minute had already been recorded, processed, and sent to the right place. Everything was operating exactly as designed. Internal notifications, operational alerts, real-time responses. But what happened with Margaret wasn't a system error. It was a human mistake, and Nicholas understood that. Well, he led her to a private lounge near the gate. Inside, the media team was ready, not to interview her, but to capture what was about to unfold: public accountability. No more apologies behind closed doors, no more quiet placating. That was the new principle Nicholas had set after similar incidents in the past. Too many mistakes had been hidden before. This time, not anymore. Back on the plane, the atmosphere shifted from quiet to real tension. Passengers whispered, no longer hiding. They looked at each other, exchanging puzzled glances. "Do you know who she is? Did you see them escorting her out? Why didn't we say anything?" In the galley, Callen remained frozen. She hadn't moved since the door opened. Her face was pale. Her hands still gripped the edge of the counter. For years, she had thought herself immune to complaints. Before it was just a report, a light conversation with the team leader. But now she was waiting to be called down by someone with a name tag and clipboard. And then it happened, Ms. Jennings. The voice was professional, cold. Very near Callen slowly turned her head. A uniformed airport manager stood in the aisle accompanied by 2 senior managers and a security officer. His tone was neutral, but there was no room for misunderstanding. "We need you to leave the plane. Mr. Heron has requested a formal meeting." Passengers near the front straightened up. A few leaned forward. Several phones were raised pretending to check messages, but actually recording. Callen swallowed hard. She adjusted her uniform mechanically, then walked down the aisle with stiff legs. The sound of her heels echoed louder than ever. She passed Haley, who was standing behind the curtain. Her arms were crossed. No smugness, no judgment, just watching. Watching the change, not from anger, not from noise, but from the quiet strength of a woman who had not bowed her head, from someone who said nothing. She let the system reveal the truth. Callen stepped off the plane and onto the jet bridge. She thought she would be taken to a discreet room, perhaps for a private conversation, maybe some paperwork, but no. She was led straight into the special waiting room, and standing right before her was Nicholas Heron. Her footsteps faltered for a moment, but everyone saw it. He didn't stand up. He didn't smile. "Miss Jennings." He said, his voice cold yet firm. "Please sit down." Callen complied, her hands clenched in her lap. Next to him was Margaret Callen, silent, composed. Nicholas pulled out a file from its folder. He didn't speak for a few seconds. The cameras were still rolling, capturing every moment. When he finally looked up, his voice was slow and clear. "You denied a basic courtesy. Then you turned a simple request into a public humiliation. And after realizing who you were facing, you apologized without acknowledging your wrongdoing." Callen opened her mouth, but Nicholas raised a finger. "Don't interrupt." He turned to Margaret Judge. "Callen, if you allow me, I want to give her a chance. Not for rebuttal, just to listen." Margaret didn't hesitate. She looked directly at Callen. "I asked for water." She said, "You looked at me and decided I didn't belong there. That was your choice. I've spent my career writing laws to protect people from decisions like that. But no law can change thinking. Only consequences can do that." Callen's face hardened, but she didn't respond. Margaret continued, her voice deep and resolute. "You didn't just disrespect me. You taught every passenger that day that some people deserve to be treated worse than others, and that cannot be fixed with a hollow apology. It must be met with responsibility." Nicholas nodded. "You are suspended immediately pending counsel review. Until then, you're temporarily relieved of your duties." Carlin's eyes began to redden, but no tears fell. She stood up, her shoulders tense, and walked out of the room. This time, it wasn't just embarrassment, it was a real change. As the door closed behind her, Nicholas turned to Margaret. "Do you want us to issue a public statement?" She shook her head. "Let silence speak for itself. They will remember it longer." And she was right. For all who witnessed what happened on the plane at the airport and later on social media, this would not be remembered as a scandal. They would remember it as a confrontation without words enough to change an entire culture. The news of what happened on flight BA 305 spread quickly beyond the airport. Just hours after landing, posts flooded social media. A blurry photo captured Margaret walking off the jet bridge with Nicholas Heron by her side. Another photo showed Carlin being escorted away. Her face-pale shoulders shaken, no captions needed. The images spoke for themselves. But the internet remained loud. Comments flooded in under hashtags like "Justice on Flight," "Your Class," and "Bias," "You Judge Callen." Some expressed outrage. Others shared similar experiences, subtle but painful moments of discrimination being dismissed or overlooked as misunderstandings. But this wasn't a misunderstanding, and everyone knew that. In the airline's executive office, Nicholas Heron sat with the leadership team. The meeting was called earlier than planned. This incident was not just an embarrassment, it was a sign of something long simmering. He stood in front of the glass-walled room, his face serious but alert. "This is not a media issue." He said, "This is a core issue about values. Our policy is first class is first class. No discrimination. No judgment." But that policy means nothing if those enforcing it don't get it right. A manager raised his hand. "Should we issue a public apology?" Nicholas shook his head. "Not yet. We don't avoid this. But this isn't about saving face. This is about real change." He tapped the file lightly on the table. "We've suspended 5 employees in the past 2 years for similar conduct. All private complaints handled internally. No one outside the company knew. Those kinds of endings are over now." Across the city, Margaret sat in her apartment, looking out at the twinkling lights on the horizon. Her hand held a cup of tea, her gaze quiet. She didn't need to watch the news. She didn't need to scroll through hashtags. She didn't expect anyone to defend her. What mattered to her was someone had faced the consequences of their choices. And most importantly, the system was starting to move. Her phone rang. It was her assistant, Lee. "The whole city's talking." Lee said, "They're asking if you'll make a statement." Margaret smiled faintly. "Let them talk. Do you want me to draft a statement? A message to clarify things?" She shook her head. "Not yet. Let the silence stay with them. Let them feel it." Meanwhile, in her small apartment, Carlin sat alone. Her uniform jacket hung quietly on the back of a chair. Her phone kept vibrating. Messages from colleagues, friends, even family. Some offering encouragement, others sharply critical. She didn't reply to any of them. Her mind kept returning to Margaret's words. "You didn't just disrespect me. You taught everyone on that flight that some people deserve to be treated worse." It wasn't said with anger. It was said with weight. And the more she thought about it, the heavier it felt. For years, she had believed that just following procedure was enough, that professionalism meant keeping a cold face. But now she saw clearly procedure isn't enough without judgment, and her judgment had been wrong. Her inbox had just received a new notification from HR required to attend a meeting with the disciplinary council. Response: within 48 hours, she stared at the screen. Her hands were still frozen on the desk. Not because she was surprised, but because for the first time she truly understood what she had done. At the airline's headquarters, Nicholas Herron and his team had begun developing a completely new training program. It wasn't just about customer service skills or memorizing procedures. It was a course that forced employees to face themselves with their biases, assumptions, and the things they brought into the cabin every day. Nicholas stood by the large window in his high-rise office, looking out toward the distant airport. "This isn't a wake-up call," he said to his chief assistant. "This is the consequence we've been avoiding." "And what about Judge Callen?" the assistant asked. Nicholas folded his arms. "She doesn't need praise, but she deserves progress." Meanwhile, Margaret, in a quiet corner of the city, sat still in her apartment. She knew that even without a loud voice change had already begun. Not from noise, but from the strength of standing firm and not looking away. The next morning, the city woke up to big headlines on every news site. Judge denied service in first class for asking for water. CEO personally handles the incident. Passengers' silence questioned, not a mistake, but a choice. The dignity of silence, the reverberating consequences. Every newspaper, every television program covered it. The news anchor debated fiercely about Margaret's experience, subtle discrimination, abuse of power. The passive role of bystanders editorials began to emerge. All of them centered around a truth that made people uncomfortable. The silence of the passengers was what enabled the humiliation. In her small apartment, Margaret sat at the edge of her sofa. The TV was still on, replaying the news, but she wasn't paying attention. Her gaze was focused on a letter in her hand sent early this morning with a cream-colored envelope stamped with the airline's logo. It was from Nicholas Herron. The message was brief. Judge Callen, thank you for your patience and grace. The board has unanimously decided to initiate a full investigation into the complaints related to first class over the past 24 months. I will also personally establish an internal accountability oversight unit. You have sparked a necessary change, something I should have started long ago. If there is anything you need publicly or privately, this line will remain open. N.H. Margaret read the letter twice, then set it down. She appreciated the gesture, but didn't need personal attention. She had never wanted to be a symbol. She had only wanted one thing: fairness, to be treated like anyone else, without suspicion, without judgment, without having to prove that she deserved her paid position. Around 10 a.m., her phone rang again. It was Lee, her assistant. There's a school in Fairmont. They want to use your speech as a case study. What speech? Margaret blinked. The one you gave at the judicial conference about bias in the courtroom. They said your response on the plane is the embodiment of the principles you outlined. Calm, in the face of confrontation, speaking up at the right time. Margaret leaned back in her chair, smiling. How funny life doesn't wait for anyone to have a podium. Lee laughed. There are plenty of invitations, law seminars, ethics forums, student panels. But I didn't do anything that remarkable, Margaret replied. Exactly. That's why you're making waves, Lee said softly. On the other side of the city, in a closed meeting room near the airport, Carlin waited for her internal review. Her hands were tightly clasped on the table. In front of her was a glass of water. This time, no one was refusing her, But the discomfort didn't lie in the request. It was in the cost of what she had not done. 3 board members walked in, accompanied by HR representatives and legal counsel. No one smiled. No one made small talk. Though this was a review, not a trial, the atmosphere felt heavy like an indictment. They asked her to recount the incident, every detail. For the first time, Callen spoke honestly with no defense. She admitted she hadn't recognized Margaret. She admitted she had judged based on impressions and instinct. She didn't cry, she didn't beg, she didn't blame anyone else. When she stopped, the room fell silent. One board member, a gray-haired man with a sharp voice, leaned forward and asked, "Do you understand why this is not just about you?" Callen nodded. Because if someone like her can be treated that way, then people without status will never have a chance. Another member made a note. "You've worked here for a long time, Ms. Jennings. Too long to claim you don't know what's right." She nodded slightly. "Now I know the board didn't give a conclusion right away. They only said you'll be notified of the outcome within 5 business days." But Callen knew clearly her career was no longer in her hands. Whether it was dismissal reassignment or a public apology, every decision was out of her control. She walked out of the building, the bright morning sun blinding. For the first time in many years, she felt something unfamiliar. Not anger, not frustration, but regret. Meanwhile, in her high-rise office, Margaret carefully placed Nicholas's letter in a drawer, next to old rulings, silent judgments, quiet victories. This wasn't the victory she had planned. Not a speech, not a trial. But she knew it mattered, and its impact would reach farther than anything she had ever written. The theme, printed on the event program that day, was simple, and to the point, responsibility in seemingly insignificant moments. When Margaret Callen stepped onto the podium, there was no applause. Only deep silence, a kind of silence that carried weight, paving the way for thoughts that would linger long after the audience left their seats. She didn't greet the crowd. She didn't waste time on ceremony. When I asked for a glass of water on that flight, she began her voice calm. I didn't think it would be an issue. I didn't intend to cause trouble. I wasn't speaking out for justice. I was just thirsty. A few people nodded slowly. Others remained still, but everyone was paying attention. But the response I received told me something I've known my whole life, that even though I paid for that seat, carrying all the necessary qualifications, wearing a suit and holding a federal judicial card, I can still be doubted, still be cast aside. Her eyes swept over the room. No one avoided her gaze, and the saddest part, she continued, wasn't that she said no. It was how she said it, as though I didn't deserve respect, didn't deserve a simple reason. A murmur of agreement rippled through the rows. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't report it immediately on the flight. I just texted someone who knew how to listen. Not because of his title, but because he understood that true power doesn't always need to be loud. Sometimes it's just calm. Margaret paused, allowing the silence to continue its work. When we landed, the damage was done. Not to me. I've grown used to being underestimated. The damage was to the passengers who chose silence, the ones who saw everything but chose comfort over conscience. She leaned forward. This isn't just about seats or uniforms, it's about how we so easily choose silence when the issue isn't happening to us. The scratch of pens taking notes echoed through the room. Some people nodded, some cleared their throats. Everyone was focused. I didn't make history on that flight. Margaret said. But I saw history repeat itself over and over. The difference this time was someone was watching, and that person had the power to make the entire system listen. She closed her speech, stepped off the podium. There was no applause at first, then slowly, like a wave, the entire room stood. Not for the drama, but because they understood. That evening, in a quiet corner of the conference center, a young woman about 23 approached Margaret. Her voice trembled lightly. "My mom's a flight attendant. She always says the job isn't just about following rules, it's about judgment. She called me after seeing what happened with you. She said," she felt ashamed, because for the first time in her life she had to rethink the way she treated others. Margaret listened quietly, not interrupting. "She's been in the job for 18 years, but she's never said that to me. So, I just wanted to thank you. Not just because you spoke up, but because you didn't let it go like it was nothing." Margaret nodded gently. A moment only truly matters when it causes someone to change someone who's never been forced to change before. Meanwhile, in a quiet break room at the airline's headquarters, Carlin Jennings sat alone. The final verdict from the disciplinary board had arrived hours ago. Termination with cause not eligible for rehire. She had expected this, but what kept her sitting still for hours was the feeling of loss she had never experienced before. She had cleared out her personal locker, returned her employee badge. But before she left, she asked for one last thing: to write a letter, not to management, not to the union, but to Margaret Callen. Now she sat there, pen in hand, unable to write the first sentence, not because she didn't know what to say, but because for the first time in years she was writing without control, without an excuse, with no way out. After several attempts, she began, "I have disappointed you, not because of a mistake, but because of a mindset I never questioned. You didn't need me to bring you a glass of water. You needed me to see you. And I didn't. I lost my job. Yes. But what hurts more is that I lost my awareness of myself. Now I have to start over. I just hope that this still means something, even if it's too late for you." She folded the letter carefully and placed it into an envelope. For the first time in many days, she felt more honest than ashamed. Back in her hotel room, hundreds of miles away, Margaret stood by her window, looking out at the city lights glowing below. She didn't know about the letter, but something told her, this story hasn't ended. It's just beginning to bring about real change. The next morning, the letter arrived. Nestled among the pile of forwarded court letters, Lee, her assistant, had placed them on the desk as usual, unaware of the small handwritten envelope on top. No sender address, just a neat handwritten note to Judge Margaret Callen. Margaret returned from her morning walk still in sneakers and a jacket. Her apartment greeted her with its familiar silence. Sunlight streaming through the wooden floor, warming the reading chair by the window. She set her keys down, poured a glass of water, and began organizing the papers. Invitations, reports, legal documents, newspapers. Then the letter, she almost set it aside. There had been so many letters lately from strangers, colleagues, admirers seeking advice. But something about this letter made her pause. The way the handwriting was written. No logo, no business card. She opened it slowly, and as she read the first few lines, she held her breath. Not because of anger, not because of hurt, but because of something else. Recognition. It was from Carlin. Margaret sat down, placed the letter in her lap, and read from the first word to the last. The letter did not justify, it did not perform, it did not ask for forgiveness. It was simple, honest, and raw, the kind of honesty most people shy away from. There was one line placed in the middle of the letter that left Margaret Callen motionless for a long time. "You needed me to see you, and I didn't." She exhaled slowly and read that line again. Margaret had heard hundreds of apologies in courtrooms, words carefully crafted by lawyers selected to soften sentences or win empathy. But this wasn't one of those, not to save face, but to face the unmasked truth and not turn away. That day, she didn't respond. Instead, she took the letter into her office and carefully placed it in a thin file, marking it "Personal Letter," a category she rarely touched. Inside that file, there were only 3 other letters. One from her father the day she passed the bar exam. One from the woman she had helped overturn a wrongful deportation order. One from a high school teacher who said Margaret was too quiet to be a leader. Now, Carlin Jennings's letter was among them, not because Margaret had forgiven her, but because it deserved to be remembered. That afternoon, Margaret attended a speaking engagement at a law school. Not to talk about case law, not about legal theory, but to speak about something few dared mention. Ethical courage. The auditorium was packed. Not just with students. There were professors, journalists, activists, and a few employees from the airline. She didn't bring notes, she didn't need them. I've thought a lot about the concept of an apology. Margaret began, her hands resting at her sides. Not the kind of apology that's easy to say, but the kind that comes after everything has fallen apart. We live in an era where everyone is afraid of being wrong, so we rehearse every word. We calculate our exit strategies. We find new ways to justify old mistakes. But what we don't do enough is sit in the discomfort of being the problem. She paused, allowing her words to sink in. This morning, I received a letter from someone who hurt me publicly, completely. But she didn't write to justify herself. She wrote to admit her wrong, not asking me to share the blame, just sitting down, facing me and acknowledging that she was wrong. A few people in the audience began to understand what she was referring to. "I'm not telling you this to gain sympathy," Margaret continued. "I'm telling you because it's rare, but it shouldn't be." She scanned the room. If you want to enter law policy or any field where power is constantly shifting, remember this: mistakes don't define you. Your response to mistakes does. After the talk, dozens of students approached with questions. Some asked about law. Some asked how to speak up when no one else dares. But one student, a young man in maintenance uniform, quiet and humble, waited until the end to approach her. His voice almost whispered. "I was on a flight once. They ignored me when I called for service. I raised my hand twice. No one came. I didn't say anything. I thought maybe I wasn't worth speaking up for." Margaret looked at him, but I still remember it. He nodded because I felt like I wasn't important enough to be noticed. Her voice softened. "You are always important. It's just that they didn't know how to look properly." He swallowed, nodded slightly, then turned away. That night, Margaret sat by her window again. The city lights sparkled like inverted stars. The story of flight. BA 305 no longer appeared in the news. The cameras had moved. The headlines had switched to the next scandal, but the change hadn't stopped. It was flowing through quieter places, offices, classrooms, coffee shops, late-night conversations between friends, those who hadn't done anything when they had the chance. And in a small apartment across the city, Carlin Jennings sat at her kitchen table. Unemployed, but not hopeless. She wrote a second letter, not to Margaret, but to herself. The heading, "The Things I Used to Believe." And with each line she peeled away another layer, rewriting the person she had never dared face. Change had begun. Not loudly, but undeniably. Weeks passed, the headlines faded away, flight, BA 305 was no longer the trending topic, the hashtag quieted, the news moved on to the next sensation. But the real impact of it all had never depended on social media. It lived in the quieter places, and those places were starting to change. At the airline's headquarters, a new department had quietly been established under Nicholas Herron's leadership. Its name, Passenger Equality, Oversight, and Flight Attendant, Ethics Department. For the first time in commercial aviation, a department with independent investigators, behavioral analysts, external ethics advisors, not just to handle complaints, but to uncover invisible patterns, biases no one had recorded yet, hidden in service practices, perceptions, and treatment. Nicholas made it clear to the board, we didn't create this department to protect the company. We created it to change the culture inside the system. That culture was changing. Bit by bit. Flight attendants now had to complete quarterly ethical scenario evaluations. The assessments weren't scored by machines, but discussed anonymously. Staff members were paired with passengers from different walks of life. The evaluation forms were updated with questions. Do you feel seen? Do you feel treated fairly? Do you feel dismissed? Every response was sent to decision makers. No press release, no marketing campaign. Nicholas made it clear. If we're doing this just to score points with the media, we're doing it for the wrong reasons. Meanwhile, Margaret returned to the courtroom, civil cases, small disputes, property lawsuits. She continued working as she always had with the same integrity that had earned her the robe. But there was something sharper in her now. She looked at each plaintiff and defendant a little longer. Not to scrutinize, but to make sure she really saw them because she knew. In the courtroom, the smallest moments build trust, and trust is the first thing to vanish when bias steps into the room. After the final court session on Thursday, Margaret Callen was packing up her files when her assistant Lee poked her head into the room. "Someone wants to meet you," Lee said softly. "She doesn't have an appointment." Margaret looked up, furrowing her brow slightly. "Who is it?" Lee hesitated before answering. "She says her name is Carlin Margaret." Froze, then nodded slowly. "Please show her in." Carlin. Jennings walked in, dressed casually in jeans and a gray sweater. No makeup. She didn't look down. She didn't shrink away. She was just honest, Judge Callen, she said quietly. Margaret motioned to the chair across from her. "Please have a seat." Carlin sat down, hands tightly clasped in her lap. "I don't want to take up too much of your time. I'm not here to ask for anything. I just need to say this directly." Margaret stayed silent, listening. "Since the hearing, I've been in therapy," Carlin continued. "I've started to examine how I see others, how I decide who deserves respect." She paused, taking a long breath. "I used to be proud of being cold by the book, thinking that made me professional, but now I realize it made me indifferent." Margaret still didn't say anything. Carlin went on. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm not expecting that. I just want you to know I don't walk through the airport the same way anymore. I don't look at passengers the same way anymore, and I will never go back to that job." She swallowed, her eyes moist, but her voice steady. "No matter what I do next, I will always remember that moment. I just wanted you to see me, just like I didn't see you." Margaret spoke slowly, her voice soft but firm. "I see you now, and I hope from now on you'll see others just as clearly." Callen nodded gently. "Thank you. That's enough." She stood up slowly, leaving the room. Margaret sat still, her hand lightly resting on the file in front of her. That moment, not loud, not showy, carried more meaning than any viral video. It proved, sometimes change doesn't come from a storm, but from a whisper from someone who finally chose to listen. That evening, as she was preparing her speech for a legal seminar, Margaret paused, took her pen, and wrote a single line at the top of the page. "The most important law is the law we enforce within ourselves." She then closed the notebook, turned off the lights, and let the silence settle. Steadfast, deserved, and earned. 3 months had passed since Flight BA 305 landed, but its impact continued to spread, not loudly, but consistently. Not where cameras focused, but in the quiet corners. At a new flight attendant training center outside Hallberg, a group of trainees sat in a modern classroom. Posters on the walls featured smiling faces, emergency exit diagrams, rows of airplane seats. But there was one prominent blackboard in the center. People don't remember what you served them. They remember how you made them feel. Below, it was a new training module, title Real Life Scenario Flight, BA 305. The instructor, a former flight manager named Carla Weaver, stood in front of the class. She started the slideshow. The first slide displayed only one name: Judge Margaret Callen. "Some of you may have heard about this incident," Carla began. "It didn't make the news for long, but for this company it marked a turning point." The room went silent. Carla recounted the events not dramatically, not with emotional bias, just the facts. A simple request, water, a prolonged silence, an attitude of disrespect, and a calm, dignified response. She paused at the slide with the quote, "This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a choice." This, Carla said, is how bias works, when you don't recognize it. She moved to the next slide, a photo of Carlin Jennings' resignation letter. And this is the image of responsibility when it's finally acknowledged. One of the students raised their hand. "Has the judge ever spoken publicly about this?" Carla smiled. She didn't need to. Her silence spoke louder than any press conference. In another part of the city, Margaret sat in a different room. Not a courtroom, not a lecture hall. A small community center, mismatched chairs, seats, arranged loosely in a circle. The reintegration program had invited her to speak to a group of women who had been incarcerated. Women who had lived within a legal system that rarely saw them clearly. She didn't sit at the head of the table. She chose a spot in the middle of the circle. "I wasn't removed from first class because of my job." Margaret began, her voice steady. "I was removed because someone thought I didn't belong there." The group listened intently. Not for the formality, but because they understood. Not from the news, from experience. Maybe some of you here have heard that voice. Margaret continued, that tone that makes you feel like you're a burden. That look that says, you should know your place. Heads started nodding. I didn't respond with shouting. I didn't call the press. I just sat quietly, and that presence was enough. A woman in her 30s, tired eyes, but a gentle voice spoke up. "But what if we have no title?" What if they don't care who we are? Margaret looked at her. Then your presence is still your strength. You don't need a cape. You don't need a microphone. You just need to know your worth. If you know it, you carry it with you, and one day they'll feel it, even if they pretend not to see. And when you carry your self-worth long enough, others will begin to feel it, even if they pretend not to see. The room was completely silent. In a small office in the Human Resources Department of Air West Airlines, Carlin Jennings was speaking with a new employee, a young Latina woman named Ana Morales, who had only been on the job for 3 weeks. This time, Carlin was no longer a flight attendant. She had returned as someone sharing professional ethical experiences, a special clause in her exit interview. If she was going to stay with the company, it would only be to teach others what not to do. She looked different. Now, less polished, less conventional, but more authentic. I used to think I was fair, Carlin said as she saw Anna intently taking notes. But fairness isn't about treating everyone the same. It's about thinking the same before you act. It's about asking yourself, why am I saying this? Anna looked up. Do you think she will forgive you? Carlin smiled faintly. She doesn't have to forgive me. She gave me something more valuable. She made me see myself for the first time. At the same time, Margaret Callen was signing the final judgment of the day, a small housing dispute case. Nothing loud, but her mind was elsewhere, thinking about all the rooms she had sat in the courtroom, the community center, the university lecture hall, the airplane cabin, each one different, but all connected by one thing. How people are seen, and how easily they can be made to feel invisible. She folded her judge's robe, turned off the courtroom lights, and stepped outside without the need to tell the world what had happened, because the world had already been told, and the resonance from that moment, silent but weighty, was still spreading. Every conversation, every decision, every gaze that chose to see, 6 months had passed since flight. BA 305 landed. Everything seemed to return to normal. News cycles shifted. Crowds moved on. For most, the incident was just another story in the ongoing saga of modern injustices. But for those who had truly listened, who had felt that silence like a stone in their chest, those memories remained. Not loud, but vivid. That evening, Margaret sat alone in the empty courtroom after the final session had ended. No celebrations, no speeches. Today marked exactly 25 years since she first took the seat as a judge. She had only asked to keep the courtroom open for 1 more hour to sit in the very place thousands had once sat. The seekers of justice, the ones afraid of being judged, the ones simply hoping to be trusted. The evening light streamed in through the glass windows. She looked up, thinking of the many times she had stood before systems that didn't believe she belonged here, because of her gender, because of her skin color, because of the way she refused to play the role society had written for her. And yet she was still here. Without needing to shout to be heard, the door behind her opened gently. Lee, her trusted assistant, stepped in. In her hands, she held a small gift box wrapped in gray paper. "I told you not to bring me anything." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "It's not a gift." Lee smiled. "It's recognition." Margaret opened the box. Inside was a framed photograph. The quality was poor, taken with a phone, but unmistakable. It was a shot of her walking off the jet bridge from flight BA 305, followed by Nicholas Heron with the airline staff and security. She had never seen this angle before. She hadn't known it existed. But what made her stop was not seeing herself in the picture, but the gaze of the people around her. The flight attendants were tense. The police were calm. Nicholas was decisive, and she composed proud, fully herself. The small plaque beneath the photo read, "The silence you held taught more than any words." Margaret didn't speak. She just lightly stroked the edge of the frame. Her face was expressionless as usual. Then she gently placed the framed photo on the chair beside her. "I didn't ask for that moment," she whispered. Lee replied softly, "I know, but you answered it." Outside, the streets were still bustling. No one knew who Margaret Callen was. No one remembered the woman who had to ask for water twice on a plane. No one saw the letter that changed a career, or the judge who never shouted but made the entire system listen. But the change was there in apologies given quicker, in hesitant glances that turned into careful looks, in stories retold in training classes at dinner tables and conversations between strangers. Do you remember that Judge Margaret stood still, holding the photo, and looked once more at the empty room? She didn't smile. That wasn't her style. But inside she felt one thing: stillness. Not avoidance, but steadiness. Waiting affirmation. I am here. I am watching. I am not afraid to be seen. And with that, she walked out of the courtroom, not toward the spotlight, but forward into her life, without changing who she was, without altering what she believed. And no one would ever forget what her silence had created when Flight BA-305 landed. No one clapped and no words were spoken. There was only silence, but not the usual kind of silence. It was the silence of awareness, of guilty glances of people who knew they had witnessed something but chose to do nothing. And then Margaret Callen, the woman who had been treated like a nuisance just for asking for a bottle of water, walked off the plane. Without anger, without retaliation, she simply walked as a symbol of steadfastness in the face of injustice. It was she who made an entire industry take a hard look at itself. One flight attendant was suspended. One policy was re-examined. A system began to dig deeper into the unconscious biases that employees bring into the cabin every day. But, more importantly, the community of passengers, those who had remained silent, were now forced to think, why didn't I say anything? Could I have done something differently? And then change began. Not loudly, not flamboyantly, but quietly, in the way people served one another, in the way looks lingered a little longer, and in the way each person asked themselves, am I looking at others with bias? Carlin Jennings, who once thought she was just following the procedure, wrote a letter not to ask for forgiveness, but to admit she was wrong. And what made Margaret keep that letter wasn't the apology, but because it was the first real, honest letter she had read in a long time. The story didn't end with a verdict. It didn't end with punishment. It ended with a transformation of a person, of a collective, and even of an entire industry. And you, the one watching this video, you may have never met Margaret Callen. You may have never been on flight BA-305, but surely in your life you've witnessed someone being treated unfairly. The question is, what did you do? Will you choose silence, or will you be the first to stand up, even if it's just with a compassionate glance? If this story moved you, please like this video to let YouTube know that human stories still matter. Share it with someone who might need to hear this. Subscribe to the channel to watch more heartfelt and meaningful stories. Because, as the quote carved beneath the photo frame in Margaret's courtroom says, the silence you hold often teaches more than any words.